نكمل بقى الراجل ده بيقول ايه.
A photograph.
It's in Ramey's right there. See it? Yeah.
Oh, wow.
See it? That's not a weather balloon. That's not a conversation about a weather balloon.
Right, no.
They're talking about the disc.
Where does it say Wright-Patterson?
It says right field.
Oh, right field.
See, that's what it was. It was right field at that time. It wasn't Wright-Patterson until later.
Oh, wow.
But it's taken to right field. And here's all the stuff there. See?
Yep. Right field.
They talk about we're going to send out a weather balloon story for a cover.
Huh.
See that?
تحت هنبعت ويذر بالون عشان نعمل كفر. ويذر بالون عشان نعمل كفر، وابعتوا حد عشان ناخد الجثث.
Right. Yeah. No. Yeah. It was definitely a cover up.
Yeah. So it's one of those kind of things where not in 1,000 years would they think that you can see this. Would you ever be able to see the telegram that he had in his hand?
Right.
هنا لما كانوا شغالون بالتكنولوجيا قديمة فالصورة طلعت من عندهم، فيعني هو كان قاعد بتكنولوجيا 47 فمش متخيل ان يعني اتعرف يعني، فما كانش واخد باله من الصورة، ما خباهاش لغاية ما طلعوا راحوا جابوا النيجاتيف بتاعها عند الراجل المصور بتاعه وطلعوه عشان يعرفوا هو كان بيقول ايه، فهو ما كان مش متخيل ان الورقة دي هتطلع.
So I say that nobody's going to be smart enough to do that, to have a fake telegram in his hand and think that 30 years later somebody's going to find the technology to read it. It's just like eventually we'll be able to get the Zapruder film, and we'll be able to have a technology that can track the heat signatures of the bullets in the emulsion on the negatives. We're going to be able to do that. Yeah. And we'll be able to find the actual heat signatures of the bullets, and so you'll know exactly where the bullets came from.
Yeah.
And by that time they'll all be dead. And that's
what did that say, Steve? However, this book written. Oh, this is talking about the EG&G engineer, right?
Yeah.
In this book written by Andy Jacobson, a respected investigator reporter offers such contrasting explanation for the Roswell mystery that I suggest you clutch something solid right now. Yeah, this is what I just explained to you. According to the Telegraph, Jacobson suggests that the flying object crash was an earthly machine. She also reported a suggestion it was sent by Stalin.
Down here is where it gets interesting. Maybe it's right here. She said children.
Stalin apparently believed that it could have been said they sent a plane full of these children created with the already exiled Mengele. That was the guy's name, the Nazi.
Mengele. Yeah.
Mengele's help over to the U.S. in order to create mass hysteria. However, the remote piloted plane, which wasn't a flying saucer, crashed. But yeah, so the Horton brothers and a bunch of these guys that were working with the Nazis, they had all kinds of crazy sci-fi looking shit they were working on that looked like flying saucers.
I mean, what I'm saying is that we've got 40, above top secret witnesses testifying to the recovery of the UFOs. Mm-hmm. And that these are not craft made by the Soviets or.
So it goes back to my original question: is if we have 40 of these people, do you really think we're going to get these people to let the cat out of the bag?
They've already given it. They've already given sworn testimony to the Senate Intelligence Committee under oath.
I'm talking about the private contractors, Patel. I'm talking about these companies.
Well, once we get subpoena power to go after them, and I can tell you, people all the time don't want to talk. They have in any case you're going to do are going to lie, are going to cheat and hide the stuff. They're going to do all that. Mm-hmm. You have to have professionals that know how to get that stuff. Mm-hmm. And as long as the Congress has made the decision that they're going to get it, they'll get it. Now they'll do everything in their power to try to stop it because it's worth trillions of dollars. If they can get the patents on anti-gravity technology, if they can get a patent on superluminal speeds of a vehicle, if they can get a patent on the metals that can withstand that kind of G-forces and stuff, if they can do that, it'll be worth trillions of dollars for them. Right. So they'll go to almost any lengths to refuse to do this. So that's why we have to have the power of the institution of Congress to be able to get behind this. And that's why, it's a slow process of being able to bring these people on. But we've now gotten the virtually unanimous support from the Democratic and Republican senators, and almost unanimous support from the members of the House, but for these few guys, Mike Turner, who is the Republican head of the Intelligence Committee, who comes from the 10th Congressional District in Ohio, Wright Patterson, and that is the Chief Field Office for Radiant Technology. That's where they are. And the other guy that he brought on is Mike Rogers, who's the head of the Armed Services Committee in the House, who comes from the 2nd District in Alabama, right next door to the Redstone Rocket Range. Okay, and that's the home office of Radiant Technology, and they've got the program which is called Prompt Global Strike. They're the ones that are trying to use the technology of the craft to propel American nuclear missiles that can be launched stateside and hit into the center of China or Russia within 2 minutes. And sure they'll do that. That's perfectly logical that they will. They're the old Sufi saying is when a pickpocket meets a saint, all he sees are his pockets. And so these guys live in the world of as soon as they see, a crashed UFO, man, we can make a weapon out of that.
Yes, exactly.
Because that's their life, that's their job, that's the prism through which they see everything. So you can't really hold it against them that they want to do that. That's their mission.
What sort of terms do you think they'd be willing to negotiate with to let the cat out of the bag, or to disclose all this stuff? Like, would you have to tell them, look, you can still control it, you guys still own it?
If you would give them the patents, on it, and you let them own it in perpetuity, so they could make trillions of dollars, that they could be making billions of dollars on every single craft that the United States built, that used that technology, and they could give the money to their shareholders so that could have more yachts, or more country houses, or give their great grandchildren and nephews, a Mercedes for their 16th birthday. These people are completely insatiable because they've got a hole in their soul. That they do not experience any kind of unitive experience. Experientially, that somehow that the universe is some kind of harmonic, unified whole, that they don't have any sense of that at all. Everything is dialectical, everything's confrontational, that there's bad guys all around all the time, that they develop an entire worldview. And that
what does that do to your mind and to your psyche when you have these secrets and you know about these secrets and nobody else does, only you and a very few people on Earth know that this shit exists? I wonder what that does to your worldview.
Well, the people who are into power, it's a chakra. It's the third chakra. The third chakra in the human body is rooted in power, the lust for power and control. Yeah. And it satisfies that. People feel privileged, and people all. If you have a Super Bowl ticket and get to sit in the box, the head of the NFL with them to watch the Super Bowl game, why are people getting off on that? Why is that? Why is that exciting some people so much? And other people are ho-hum. They don't care about that at all. But a worldview is extraordinarily important thing. That's how I ended up eventually at Harvard Divinity School. Is that I'm in F. Lee Bailey's office. I'll tell you a story. I'm sitting in F. Lee Bailey's office, right? And it turns out that what had happened is this little old man who owned a little mom and pop grocery store in Boston, in the north end of Boston. A Friday afternoon, two big no-neck guys come into his store and say they want to sell him Angulo fire insurance company. And he said, I don't need fire insurance. I've already got fire insurance. And they said, well, you don't have kind of fire insurance that'll keep your place from being burnt down next Friday night. And he looked at them like that, and he just rolled up his sleeve and he said, "Look you see these numbers right here, tattooed on my arm? I got those at Auschwitz," he said. You people don't fucking scare me at all, because I've been through the worst. Big mistake on his part. Because what they did is they found out that he had a daughter, a single child, who was like 9 months, 8 months pregnant with her first baby, and they tracked her down on the Mass Pike and chased her down on the pike, and she pulled off the road and went into a phone booth to try to call an emergency call to get help. And they got out of the car and shotgunned her right through the glass and killed her and the baby, and she was dead. And the shit hit the fan. And it was in all the newspapers, you know, the Boston Globe, all over the place, right? And
what are the ones that killed her?
It was the Angiulo brothers, Mikey Angiulo. You know, gave the order to kill her. You know, and I'm sitting in the office. I was sitting in the office with Lee Bailey, right? And I get a call from Lee, and he says, "Danny," he said, "have you seen the stuff in the papers there about the killing out on the pike?" And I said, "Yeah." He says, "Come on in here. Come on down." So I go down the hall to his office. I come down, and here's Al Johnson, who's the managing partner at the firm, and Bad Andy Tooney, who's Andy Tooney, who was the head of the Strangler Bureau. They caught the DeSalvo, the Boston Strangler, right? Bailey got appointed by the court to defend him, and Bailey stole Andy. He was the head of the Strangler Bureau for the Massachusetts State Police. So they're sitting in the office, right? And they're saying, "Oh yeah, did you see this thing? You know, I'm anticipating getting a call from Mikey Angiulo to ask us to defend him on this thing." Because what's happened here is, catch this, is like 3 to 4 days after the killing, and with all this roaring going on in all the news media, you know, somebody drives past the place where she was killed like 100 miles an hour and tosses this guy out of the car and bounces him down the highway, and he's laying there dying beside the highway. The Massachusetts State Patrol, Highway Patrol, find him, pull up and find him laying by the road, and they recognize him as one of Mikey Angiulo's people. He said, "Joey, you're dying." He said, tell me who did this. What's this about?" He says, "Are you the guy that pulled the trigger on this lady?" And he said, "Yes, I am." He said, "Well, who told you to do it? Who gave you the order?" And he said, "Mikey Angiulo." And then they bring the ambulance, they bring him to Mass General, and he survives. He lives.
Whoa.
And so now they're getting set to
shit.
prosecute him, and they're going to turn him on Mikey Angiulo, right? And so Lee calls me into his office. And I'm sitting there with Lee and Al Johnson and Bad Andy. And we're sitting there, and he said, "I'm anticipating he's probably going to call us to try to retain us to represent him." He said, "Danny, you wrote your honors thesis at Harvard College, right, on like the Fifth Amendment and the right against self-incrimination." So I said, "Yeah, I did. I was predicting the Miranda decision in my thesis at the college." You know, and he says, so he says, that I want you to stay here because I'm expecting a call from him. And the door opens, and his secretary says, "Lee," she said, "it's Mikey Angiulo." So I'm sitting there in the office, and he goes, he goes over and he picks up the telephone, and you hear him say, "Yeah, Mikey, yeah, I saw that. Oh shit, yeah, that's really terrible. Yeah, no, I hear you, yeah, no, we'll do that. We'll represent you. Yeah, no, that'll be $1 million cash." Anyways, he says, and that's for us, but for the investigation thing, the Moriarty and Associates, that's another $1 million. Whoa, no, Mikey, no, hey, well, Mikey, well, you too. He said, look at, if you want to come, and he slams the phone down on him like that. And so he's sitting there and he's laughing, and he's saying, "No," he says, "look at," and he reaches in his pocket, he takes out his wallet, and he takes out $100 bill, and he lays it on the table, and he says, $100. He calls back within 15 minutes. And Al Johnson reaches in his wallet, takes out a couple of $50 bills, and he says, "Okay, a 10. I got 100 on 10. He'll call within 10 minutes." And Bad Andy says, "I'll take a piece of that." He says, "Look, I'll take the 5 minutes. I'll take 5 minutes." So Bailey turns to me and he says, "Danny, you want a piece of this? That's literally, you want a piece of this?"
Yeah, yeah.
I said to myself, "What the am I doing in this room with these people?" I said, "I do not want to be here." And we'd already found out that he was on Index 4 anyway. I already told you. Right. So I get up and leave the office, right? And so a day later, I'm sitting in my office, and it must be 5 o'clock in the afternoon. So in walks Lee with Mikey Angiulo. He comes walking in, and Mikey, he says, "Danny, this is Mikey Angiulo." And Angiulo walks over and sticks his hand out at me like that. And I sit there and I just look at him. And I say, "Yeah, I know who you are. I know who you are." And Angiulo says, "Oh, Lee says that you don't want to help me. You don't want to do anything on this case. He says everybody's got a right to have a defense." And I said, "Not from me." And he says, "Well, look, I wanted to have you kind of help me on this." I said, "Look, let me be really clear, Mr. Angelo. I wouldn't piss on you if you were on fire."
Right.
You understand? And he just looked at me, and Lee almost cracked his pants. And I said, "Because look," I said, "I know who you are, and I know what you do, and I think that you kill people, who you think betray you.
Mhm.
So I don't ever want to be in a position where you're ever going to think that I'm going to betray you,
Right.
because I won't put a pencil to paper to help you.
Right.
So, and I'll never have to worry about betraying you." And he just looked at me and he just burst out laughing like that.
That's incredible.
And I just would not have anything to do with these people, and so I realized that this is a completely different worldview. And so I would talk with Lee about, why, you got this whole practice, you're a great criminal defense attorney, you got this entire private investigation firm, of Moriarty and associates, just to figure out all the facts on everything, right? And I said, and why don't you do something good? About this, that you got a whole lot of, you got a lot of notoriety. You can do really good things. It was like talking to a wall. It was like, and he said, everybody's got a right to a defense,
Right.
And I said, yeah, but these are professional criminals. I mean, they're total gangsters, these people. He said, well, everybody's entitled to a defense, and so I got into this kind of row with him. So I leave that Friday afternoon. I'm staying in his place over on Beacon Hill, right? And he's living out in Walpole or something, because he's now married to his third wife, so I'm staying at the place. So I go to church on Sunday morning over at was St. Cecilia's. So I go over to St. Cecilia's, and I come out of church, and I'm kind of wandering back over to our Beacon Hill, and I stop in at a bookstore, and I'm kind of looking around at the books like I do sometimes, and I found John Rawls' Theory of Justice. John Rawls is the head of the Department of Philosophy at Harvard University, and he's written this major treatise on justice.
Mhm.
And long story short, I read through the thing, and he says that there's this whole group of people, which he calls the intuitionists, who are the ones who make these kind of statements like, all men are created equal, endowed by their creator with certain inalienable rights, and their life, liberty, and they've got all these rights and stuff, and they are a counterforce in our country to what they call the majoritarian utilitarians, who, if our people are faced with a choice between one policy or another, they will pick the one theoretically that generates the greatest good for the greatest number, right? John Stuart Mill, utilitarianism, but he says it doesn't happen that way. He says, if that were true, what Rawls says in his Theory of Justice, that, then the 90% of us that are white would still own the 10% of the people that are black. He said, but we don't, because there's this other group called the intuitionists, who keep making these kind of proclamations about natural law and their natural rights and all that. And so I saw it. So I bring it home, I buy a copy, and I go home and I read it. And I call up John Rawls, and I talk to his secretary, and I'm saying, I graduated from Harvard College and Harvard Law School, and I did this and did that, and I'm waving the school tie through the phone at her. And I said, I'd like to get a chance to talk to Professor Rawls, about this, about his new book. And so she calls me back a little bit later. She says, okay, you can get 30 minutes, Wednesday afternoon. So I go over and sit down with John Rawls, the head of the Department of Philosophy at Harvard University, and I start talking to him about what's caused me to come and talk with him about this. Because, I've got this thing with Lee Bailey. I've been at the Cahill firm. The Cahill firm was trying to get me to represent the Arkansas, Missouri Power Company that was trying to buy an all-black company and raise the rates, and I wouldn't do it, And so the bottom line is, I was explaining this all to him, and he ended up talking me into coming back to Harvard, to coming back and doing a master's and a PhD in comparative social ethics, comparing and contrasting different worldviews. And it was there that I began to really study and find out that people have completely different worldviews about things. And we got to understand what the underlying premise was of different people's worldviews that are even unconscious. They don't even know sometimes what they believe. And so I ended up doing the work there. And that's why I got recruited by Jesuit National Headquarters, because I've been writing some papers and stuff in my master's work. And Father Roger Couture, who teaches the course at Harvard Divinity School on the theological underpinnings of human rights, called me in and said, he said, look, I'm astonished here at these papers you've been writing and the work that you've been doing on this. Are you aware of the fact, I can tell that you're Catholic, he said, from the way you're writing. He said, but, and I checked out, you're not married or anything. He said, are you aware of the fact that the Jesuits, that the Father General of the Jesuits, Pedro Arrupe, has called all 100 provincials of the Jesuit order into Rome to do some major treatise on social justice. And they're going to create a new national headquarters in Washington, D.C., and they're looking for a general counsel. And I've recommended you. Would you be willing to do an interview with them? So I said, sure, and so I did. And they asked me to become general counsel at the Jesuit headquarters. So we had 10,000 Jesuits all around the world. We got doing social justice documents. And turns out that the Jesuit order has become a huge source of all the social justice documents that are being published by the Catholic Church. And Pope Francis, who's the first Jesuit in history to ever become Pope, and so that I was right there at the international headquarters, where we were dealing with, liberation theology, all the stuff in South America. And I knew all the people. I knew Gutierrez. I knew everybody who writes these things. And I got to go to Rome and meet with the Superior General, with Pedro Arrupe, and so that I was right in the catbird seat. And what I brought in the professional investigators from Lee Bailey's office, the people that were in Moriarty and Associates, because they all knew me. Right. And they knew that I had thrown this big shit fit and that I wouldn't work for the organized crime people. I wouldn't do any of that stuff. Mm-hmm. So these guys were all calling me up saying, oh, if you've got anything I can do to help you, can I help you with some stuff that, you're doing the kind of things that I always hoped that I could really do. And so we became this source of them getting to do good things together, right? And so here I was at Jesuit headquarters, so I had access to all the Jesuit guys around the world. I had the investigators from Bailey's office, and we started putting together a group, and I had access. The secret that I had, is that William Johnstone Taylor, who was appointed to me to be my chief investigator, 3-tour Vietnam Marine Corps CID, Criminal Investigation Division, liaison to the CIA in Saigon, was my investigator.